Joshua Reeds remembers his 6th birthday like it was yesterday. The sun was shining, the house was filled with laughter, and the smell of cake lingered in the air. He was just a kid, living in a quiet little town in Oregon, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened. As a graphic designer now, Joshua likes to think he's got an eye for the unusual, but back then, his only concern was tearing open presents. That day, though, one gift stood out, a small talking bear his uncle gave him. It was cute, with its high-pitched voice spouting silly, pre-recorded phrases. For a 6-year-old, it was perfect. At first, everything seemed fine. Joshua loved playing with the bear, and it quickly became his favorite toy. It had a button on its paw that, when pressed, would make it talk. "Hi there, buddy," or "Let's play." The usual harmless stuff you'd expect from a kid's toy. His parents were happy it kept him entertained, and for a while Joshua didn't think much of it. The toy was just a fun little companion, one of those things that kids grow attached to for no particular reason. But then something changed. It wasn't immediate, just little things at first. Joshua noticed that the bear would say things that didn't quite fit the script. It wasn't anything too alarming, just odd. Instead of its cheerful phrases, the bear would sometimes say things like, "Come closer," or "I see you." And Joshua figured the toy was malfunctioning, and being a kid, he didn't think much of it. He laughed it off and kept playing, even though the tone of the voice seemed off. His parents weren't so sure, though. His dad once heard the bear saying something strange and joked about how toys these days were probably made too cheap. His mom suggested they should return it, but Joshua protested, claiming it was just a glitch. After all, it still made him laugh most of the time, and kids don't let go of their favorite things that easily. So, they shrugged it off, deciding not to make a big deal about it. Joshua can't remember the exact day it happened, but one afternoon, the bear said something that stopped him cold. It was still in that high-pitched, playful voice, but the words were different. "Don't leave me." Joshua stared at the toy, confused. He hadn't pressed the button, but there it was, speaking on its own. He tried to laugh, tried to tell himself it was just a toy acting weird, but that phrase stuck with him. There was something unsettling about the way it was said. Things only got stranger from there. The phrases became darker, more bizarre. Sometimes the bear would just speak without anyone touching it. "I'm watching," or "Come find me," it would say, as though the toy itself was aware of something Joshua couldn't see. He didn't tell his parents about it. After all, what could they do? It was just a toy, right? And yet something about it didn't feel right. Joshua didn't know it yet, but that bear was more than just a malfunctioning toy. It was the beginning of something far more disturbing. As Joshua continued playing with the toy, the bear's voice began to change. It wasn't gradual. It just happened one day, like a switch had been flipped. Instead of its usual cheerful tone, the bear's voice became deeper, almost guttural. Joshua could feel the shift immediately, but he didn't know how to explain it. The phrases weren't playful anymore. They were eerie, unsettling. "Come closer," the bear would say, in a tone that felt more like a command than an invitation. Joshua's parents started to notice the change as well. His mom, who had brushed off the bear's weird phrases before, was now uneasy about the toy. His dad tried to fix it, thinking the batteries were low or the voice box was damaged, but nothing worked. In fact, when they tried removing the batteries altogether, the bear still talked. This wasn't one of those moments you could laugh off anymore. Something was very, very wrong, and Joshua's parents knew it. One night, Joshua was woken up by the sound of the toy talking again. But this time it wasn't saying anything random. It was using his voice. "Mom, Dad," the bear said, mimicking Joshua perfectly. "Come here. I need you." The hairs on Joshua's arms stood up. He hadn't pressed the button, hadn't even been near the toy, but it was calling out to his parents like it was him. His heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time he felt real fear. Joshua ran to his parents' room, clutching the bear in his arms, but by the time he got there, the toy had gone silent again. His parents listened patiently as he explained what had happened, but they were skeptical. A talking toy mimicking their son? It sounded too bizarre to be true. His dad even tested the bear right there, pressing the button repeatedly, but all it did was repeat the usual lines. "Hi there, buddy. Let's play." Joshua's face went pale. It was like the bear was playing with him, taunting him. That same night, the bear spoke again, this time from the hallway outside Joshua's room. He could hear it faintly through the door, repeating the phrase, "Come closer." But when he opened the door, there was nothing there, just the toy sitting perfectly still on the floor. His parents had already gone to bed, and Joshua knew it was useless to wake them again. He was on his own with this thing. From that point on, the bear's voice grew more menacing, less like a toy and more like something that shouldn't be able to speak at all. Its phrases became darker, more deliberate, as if it was trying to communicate something far more sinister. Joshua stopped playing with it, but it didn't matter. The bear would speak on its own now, whenever it wanted, and what it said wasn't meant for fun. After that night, Joshua's parents had had enough. His mom, visibly shaken by the strange occurrences, insisted that the toy be locked away. She didn't care if it was a malfunction or something worse. She just wanted it out of the house. His dad reluctantly agreed, carrying the bear up to the attic and stuffing it into an old cardboard box. Joshua watched, half relieved and half terrified, as the attic door was shut tightly. For the first time in weeks, the house felt normal again. For a few days, life went back to the way it used to be. The house was quiet, and Joshua didn't hear the toy's voice anymore. His parents seemed calmer, and Joshua almost started to believe that maybe everything had been in his head. Maybe it had all been just a weird series of glitches with a cheap toy. He even slept through the night without waking up in a cold sweat, thinking he'd hear that deep, unsettling voice again. But of course, that sense of peace didn't last long. One evening, as Joshua was helping his mom with dinner, they both heard a faint thud coming from upstairs. His mom froze, her eyes wide as she stared at the ceiling. Joshua's stomach dropped. The attic. His dad shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the house settling, but Joshua wasn't so sure. That night, the house felt different again, like the air was heavier. He told himself it was just his imagination running wild, but deep down, he knew better. Then, a few nights later, it happened. Joshua woke up in the middle of the night, his throat dry, his room eerily quiet. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, when he noticed something was missing. The box. The toy. He ran to the attic, his heart pounding in his chest. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and there, in the corner where the box had been placed, was nothing. The bear was gone. The toy hadn't just been moved, it had vanished entirely. His parents were still asleep, unaware of what had happened. Joshua stood frozen, the darkness of the attic pressing in on him, his mind racing. Where could it have gone? There was no way it had simply disappeared on its own, right? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just some malfunctioning toy. There was something else at play here, something that wanted out. Joshua didn't sleep that night. How could he, knowing that somewhere in the house, or maybe somewhere outside, that bear was lurking? He listened for hours, straining to hear the voice that had once haunted him, but there was only silence. It was almost worse than the noise. The absence of it, the waiting, knowing that the toy was out there but not knowing when or where it would return, gnawed at him. And deep down, Joshua knew the worst was yet to come. Years passed, and Joshua did his best to forget about the bear and the strange events that haunted his childhood. He moved out of his parents' house, went to college, and eventually started a career as a graphic designer. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, and the toy became a distant, foggy memory. Every now and then, though, the thought of it would creep into his mind. He would wonder where it had gone, what had really happened that night in the attic, but he never dared ask his parents about it again. It was easier to pretend it had never happened. But then, the dreams started. At first, they were vague. Joshua would hear a voice in the distance, deep and distorted, calling his name. It felt familiar, but he couldn't place it. Night after night, the dreams grew more vivid. The voice became clearer, and Joshua began to recognize it. It was the same voice from his childhood, the one that had spoken from the bear. Except now, It wasn't just in his dreams. It was in his home. Joshua started waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with that same voice echoing in his ears. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the remnants of a nightmare bleeding into his waking hours. But then, small things around the house began to move. A book would be out of place. A toy that wasn't his would appear in the living room, and every time, he would hear that voice, low, deliberate, and growing closer. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that stress from work was getting to him. Maybe he was overworked, maybe it was just a sleep disorder, or maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But the voice wouldn't stop. It was always just on the edge of his perception, whispering his name, repeating the phrases he had heard as a child. "Come closer," it would say, or "I'm watching you." Every time he heard it, his heart would race, and he would feel that same cold, creeping fear from his childhood. Joshua started avoiding certain parts of his apartment, especially at night. The shadows seemed to move in ways they hadn't before, and the once familiar comfort of his home became unsettling. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was no longer alone. It was as if the bear, no, whatever had been inside the bear, was back. But this time, it didn't need the toy. It was something more, something that had followed him into adulthood, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. It wasn't long before the voice began speaking louder, no longer confined to the shadows or his dreams. He would hear it in broad daylight, while working, while watching TV, always faint at first, but growing in intensity. Joshua tried to ignore it, tried to push it out of his mind, but it was no use. The voice was back, and it wanted something. It was no longer content just watching. It was coming for him. One night Joshua woke to the sound of the voice, but this time, it wasn't in his dreams. It was in the room with him. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding, the darkness around him feeling thicker, more oppressive than ever before. The voice was no longer a whisper. It spoke clearly, like someone was standing right beside him. "Let me in," it said, the tone calm but demanding, like it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. Joshua's hands shook as he fumbled for the light, but even when the room was illuminated, the voice didn't stop. "I'm here," it said again, sending a chill down his spine. His eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there, just shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in ways they shouldn't. It didn't feel like a dream, and that's what terrified him the most. This was real, and whatever had been in the bear all those years ago was no longer confined to the toy. It had found a way to cross over, and now it was here. Desperate, Joshua scrambled out of bed, trying to shake the feeling of dread that clung to him. He ran from room to room, flipping on every light, but the voice followed him, growing louder, closer. "Let me in," it repeated, but this time, the voice wasn't just coming from one direction. It was all around him, as if the walls themselves were speaking. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, the helplessness of knowing there was nowhere to run. In a last-ditch effort, Joshua bolted for the front door, hoping to escape whatever nightmare this had become. But as his hand gripped the doorknob, he froze. The voice didn't sound distant anymore. It was right behind him. Slowly, he turned around, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows in the room seemed to coalesce, forming the vague shape of something familiar. It was the bear, but twisted, distorted into something monstrous, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. The creature that had once spoken through the bear was no longer content with just words. It wanted more, and Joshua could feel its intent pressing in on him, suffocating him. "You can't run," it hissed, the voice low and mocking. Joshua backed away, his mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. It had waited years for this moment, biding its time, growing stronger, and now it was ready to claim what it had always wanted: him. The lights flickered as the creature moved closer, its form shifting and writhing like smoke in the air. Joshua's back hit the wall, his heart racing as the shadows swallowed him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The voice, the same voice from all those years ago, filled his ears one last time. "You belong to me," it said. And as the darkness closed in, Joshua knew there was no escaping it. The creature had found him, and this time it wouldn't let him go. Sarah Daniels had always been the kind of person who could lose herself in memories, especially the ones from her childhood. Now, as a school teacher in a quiet Midwestern town, she found herself reflecting more often than ever. The town was small, and there wasn't much to distract her from her thoughts. She remembered how, as a kid, she and her friends would sneak off to a little playground hidden at the edge of town. It was forgotten, really, overgrown, neglected. That's why they loved it. They could play there without any adults telling them what to do, but the playground had always felt off. Even on the brightest summer days, there was something strange about it. The swings creaked like someone had just jumped off, the merry-go-round would spin on its own for no reason, and the trees around it seemed darker somehow. Still, it was their secret spot. They would play for hours, laughing and running around, feeling like they were the only ones in the world. It wasn't until later that Sarah would realize they weren't alone. Something had been there all along, watching. One day, while Sarah and her 3 best friends were playing, they found something strange. Beneath the sandbox, hidden under a thin layer of sand, there was a rusty metal hatch. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. They stared at it for a long time, debating whether or not to open it. None of them had ever noticed it before. It was weird, but their curiosity got the better of them. You know how kids are. Once they find something secret, they just have to explore it. So, with a lot of effort, they pried it open. The tunnel below was pitch black. Cold air rushed up, sending a shiver through Sarah's spine, but the excitement outweighed the fear. They all looked at each other, wide-eyed, eager for an adventure. Sarah had always been the cautious one, but that day, she felt a pull. It was almost like the playground had been hiding something important, something meant for them to discover. She didn't think twice. Before she knew it, they were all climbing down, one by one, into the unknown. As soon as they entered, something felt wrong. The air inside the tunnel was heavy, and there was a faint smell, like damp earth and something else she couldn't quite place. They only had one small flashlight between the 4 of them, but it was enough to see that the walls were covered in markings. Strange, glowing symbols, almost like graffiti, but older, much older. At first it was exciting, like they had stumbled onto some ancient secret. But as they walked further in, the excitement started to fade. The deeper they went, the quieter everything became. Their usual chatter turned into whispers, then silence. Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't want to be the first to say she was scared. Still, there was no shaking the feeling that they were walking into something they shouldn't be, something that had been waiting for them. That's when Sarah realized the playground wasn't just abandoned, it was hiding something. And now that they had found it, it wasn't going to let them go easily. As Sarah and her friends descended deeper into the tunnel, their childish excitement slowly gave way to a creeping sense of dread. They didn't talk much anymore, just shuffled forward in silence, their footsteps echoing in the cold, narrow space. The flashlight's beam flickered as if the batteries were already dying, casting long, shaky shadows on the walls. The strange symbols glowed faintly, almost like they were watching. Sarah could feel it too, that sense of being watched. But none of them wanted to admit they were scared. After all, they had come this far. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It was like the air was heavier down there, thick with an eerie stillness that made it hard to breathe. Every step felt more difficult than the last, and those symbols. They weren't just random scribbles anymore. The patterns seemed to shift whenever the light moved, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Sarah felt like they were leading her somewhere, but where and why? She could tell her friends were starting to feel the same. You could see it in their faces, the nervous glances, the hesitation in their steps. Then, something strange happened. One of her friends, James, began to slow down, falling behind the group. At first, they didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just scared and didn't want to admit it. But then he stopped completely. "Guys, wait!" he called, but his voice sounded off, quieter, almost muffled, like the tunnel was swallowing the sound. Sarah turned back to see him standing still, looking confused. "Come on, James, stop messing around," one of the others said, trying to lighten the mood. But the joke fell flat. Something wasn't right. They all stood there staring at James, waiting for him to move. But he didn't. He just stood there, staring back at them, wide-eyed, frozen in place. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "James?" she called softly, but he didn't respond. The others were starting to panic now, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. Before Sarah could say anything, the light flickered again, plunging them into brief darkness. When the light returned, James was gone. No sound, no movement, just gone. Panic washed over them in an instant. They ran back to where he had been standing, but there was no sign of him. Just the cold, empty tunnel. "He must have gone back up," one of them said. But they all knew that wasn't true. James wouldn't just leave like that. Sarah felt her heart race as the reality of the situation started to sink in. Something had taken him. Something from the dark. Something that had been watching them from the moment they opened that hatch. They all stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation. At least, not one that made any sense. The tunnel felt different now. Darker. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, glowing a little brighter, as if they were alive. Sarah felt a wave of nausea hit her, but she didn't want to show it. Not now. They had to keep moving. There was no going back. Not anymore. The panic set in quickly, and there was no calming it now. Sarah and the remaining two friends were gripped by the same sense of helplessness. They had come down into this tunnel thinking it was an adventure, but now it felt more like a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. The air around them grew colder with each step, like the warmth of the outside world was being sucked away, replaced by something far more sinister. The flashlight flickered again, and they huddled closer together, afraid to let the darkness fully claim them. As they walked, Sarah started to notice the walls seemed to close in. The tunnel felt narrower, pressing against them like a weight. Her breath came out in shaky gasps as her heart pounded in her chest. The faint whispers began, but not from any of them. It was a sound deeper in the tunnel, something soft, almost like wind, but too purposeful to be anything natural. The others heard it too, judging by the look in their eyes. They exchanged nervous glances but kept moving forward, because what else could they do? They couldn't go back. They couldn't stay. Then, without warning, the whispers grew louder. They didn't sound like the wind anymore. They sounded like voices echoing all around them, but distorted, as though coming from deep within the walls. Sarah tried to tune it out, but it was impossible to ignore now. The symbols on the walls, those strange glowing shapes, pulsed brighter with each passing second. It felt like they were drawing her in, pulling her deeper into the tunnel with no escape in sight. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, but her feet kept moving forward as if she was under some unseen force. Suddenly, without a sound, the ground beneath her friend, Mark, shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight give, but in an instant, he was gone. 1 second he was walking beside her, the next, he vanished. It was like the tunnel itself had swallowed him whole, without warning or sound. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, eyes wide with shock, heart racing faster than ever. She and her last remaining friend, Emma, stood frozen, staring at the spot where Mark had been. There was no hole, no sign of anything out of the ordinary, just the endless, suffocating darkness. The terror was undeniable now. Sarah grabbed Emma's arm, squeezing hard as they both struggled to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no words, no explanations. Just the gut-wrenching reality that they were losing each other, one by one, to something they couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't even understand. The tunnel was claiming them, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for them to wander too deep. Emma was trembling beside her, and for the first time since they'd entered the tunnel, Sarah felt real fear creeping into her chest. Not the kind of fear you can brush off, but the kind that roots itself deep inside, making it hard to breathe. They were running out of time, and they both knew it. But no matter how hard they tried, there was no way back. The entrance had disappeared behind them, leaving only the pulsing cymbals and the cold, echoing whispers that seemed to be growing louder. They were trapped, and Sarah had no idea how to save them. As they moved forward, Sarah's mind raced with thoughts of what had happened to her friends. James had disappeared so quickly, and now Mark had been taken too. The tunnel had turned into something out of a nightmare, something alive. The walls seemed to shift and change as they walked, and every step felt like it was taking them further away from reality. Sarah couldn't stop thinking that they were walking straight into the unknown, and whatever was waiting for them ahead, it wasn't going to let them leave easily. Sarah and Emma pushed forward, their steps hurried and clumsy as the fear gripped them tighter. Every second felt like they were teetering on the edge of something horrible, and Sarah's chest ached from the sheer panic building up inside her. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever now. No end in sight, just the relentless dark and the whispering voices that followed them. Emma clung to Sarah, her grip tight and desperate, but even that comfort was slipping away. They were running out of hope, out of time, and they both knew it. The whispers started getting louder, closer. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just voices, they were her friends' voices. She swore she could hear James and Mark, their words garbled, distorted, but unmistakably them. The worst part was, they weren't calling for help. No, it was like they were beckoning her forward, asking her to join them. She could feel her pulse in her ears, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Emma must have heard them too because she kept shaking her head, muttering under her breath that it wasn't real, that they had to keep moving. Suddenly, without any warning, Emma's hand slipped from Sarah's. The warmth that had been there just a second ago vanished, leaving only cold air where Emma had stood. Sarah whipped around, her heart sinking as she realized what had happened. Emma was gone. No sound, no scream, just the same eerie silence that had swallowed the others. Sarah's throat tightened, her pulse racing as her mind tried to grasp what had just happened. She had been holding on to Emma. They had been together. How could she just be gone? Sarah's legs felt weak, her body trembling as she stumbled backward, eyes wide as if searching the darkness for a trace of her friend. But there was nothing. Just the glowing symbols on the walls, brighter now, almost blinding. She called out for Emma, but her voice was swallowed by the tunnel, the echoes bouncing back at her like cruel, mocking reminders of her helplessness. She was alone, completely and utterly alone in this dark, suffocating place that seemed to have no end. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. She couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnel had claimed her friends, that whatever force was down here had been waiting for them all along. The whispers swirled around her, almost taunting, and Sarah couldn't tell if they were real or if her mind was finally starting to break. Her friends' voices grew louder, clearer, but the words they spoke were wrong, warped, twisted, filled with something dark and sinister. They weren't her friends anymore. Whatever was down here had taken them. Sarah stumbled forward, half running, half falling through the tunnel. Her legs felt like lead, her head pounding with fear and exhaustion. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The darkness was closing in around her, the walls shifting, the symbols glowing like embers, burning into her memory. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to outrun whatever was following her, but deep down she knew it was no use. The tunnel didn't want her to leave. It wanted her to stay. As she ran, the voices followed her, louder and louder, until they were all she could hear. They weren't just in the tunnel anymore. They were in her head, pushing her to the brink of madness. She could feel it, the darkness creeping into her mind, twisting her thoughts, making her question what was real and what wasn't. And as she stumbled further into the abyss, one thought echoed louder than all the rest. She was never getting out. Now, years later, Sarah Daniels finds herself haunted by the memories of that playground, by the tunnel and the voices that have never truly left her. No matter how far she gets from that place, it's like the dark follows her. She's tried to move on, tried to build a life, but it's impossible when every night she can still hear them, her friends, calling from beneath the ground. Their voices are the same as they were back then, yet twisted in ways that make her shudder. They beg for help, but there's something malevolent behind their pleas, something that wants to pull her back in. Sarah's learned to live with the constant fear, but it's exhausting. Each day, she walks by that playground, now fenced off and covered in warning signs, as if that could stop whatever lurks below. The town's forgotten about it, just as they forgot about her friends. No one asks questions anymore. It's like the world has moved on, leaving her trapped in this endless loop of guilt and terror. But she knows better. She knows that whatever lives beneath the playground is still waiting, still hungry. The hatch is still there, sealed tight, but Sarah feels its pull every time she passes by. Sometimes she dreams of the tunnel, of the glowing symbols and the cold, dark air that seem to swallow everything around her. In the dreams, her friends are there, just out of reach, their faces twisted and blurred, like they're no longer fully human. The tunnel stretches out before her, endless and unforgiving, the voices louder with each step. It's always the same. They want her to come back. They tell her that they're waiting for her, that they need her. And every time she wakes up drenched in sweat, Sarah feels the overwhelming urge to return, even though she knows what awaits her. Despite everything, there's a part of her that can't let go of the guilt. She feels responsible for what happened to her friends, even though she knows it wasn't her fault. The voices never let her forget that. They remind her every night that she left them behind, that she escaped when they couldn't. Sarah has spent years trying to convince herself that there's nothing she could have done, that the tunnel claimed them long before she had a chance to save anyone. But deep down, she knows the truth. It's not over. It's never been over. She's told people about it before, but no one believes her. The few times she's tried to explain, they've brushed it off as childhood trauma or nightmares that have stuck with her into adulthood. But Sarah knows better. The tunnel is real. The voices are real. And whatever lives down there is still waiting. She doesn't know how much longer she can resist the pull. The dreams are getting worse, more vivid, and the voices are growing louder, more insistent. Every time she passes the playground, she feels it. The call to return, to finish what started all those years ago. Sarah's afraid that one day she won't be able to fight it anymore. She knows that the tunnel is waiting for her, just as it waited for her friends, and when the time comes, she'll have no choice but to go back. The voices will drag her down, and she'll finally understand what happened to them, what still haunts that forgotten place. As the years go by, Sarah can feel the darkness creeping closer, a constant reminder that the nightmare is far from over. One day the hatch will open again, and when it does, there will be no escaping the voices beneath. Michael Hensley still remembers that night clearly, like a stain that refuses to fade. He was just 8 years old, living in a quiet, sleepy town in Oregon. It was the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, and kids could wander until the streetlights came on. His childhood had been pretty typical up until that moment, but things took a sharp turn the night he saw the figure. Michael had been lying in bed, staring out of his bedroom window, something he often did before falling asleep. That's when he saw it for the first time, a pale, motionless child standing outside. At first, he thought it was one of the neighborhood kids playing some kind of prank, but something about the figure didn't sit right with him. It didn't move. Not an inch. The figure just stood there staring up at him, its face blank and expressionless. Michael could feel his heart race, thumping in his chest as he squinted to get a better look. The moonlight barely lit the yard, but he could make out the pale skin and the dark hollows where eyes should have been. It was like the figure wasn't really there, yet it was. Michael had scrambled out of bed and run to tell his parents, but as is typical with adults, they brushed him off. His dad had chuckled, saying it was probably a tree or his overactive imagination. His mom told him to go back to bed, insisting that nothing was outside. But Michael wasn't so sure. He knew what he had seen, and it wasn't just some trick of the light or a kid playing games. When he looked out again, the figure was still there, still staring. The strangest part? The figure never blinked. Michael found himself fixated on that one detail. How could someone stand so still, eyes locked on him for what felt like hours, without blinking once? Every fiber in his body told him to pull the curtains shut, to hide under the covers, but he couldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, frozen by those empty eyes. It felt like the figure was waiting for something, but what, he couldn't tell. Night after night, Michael would find himself drawn to the window, dreading what he might see. And every time, the figure would be there. Always the same, always standing in the same spot, never closer, but never farther away. His young mind struggled to understand what was happening. He thought about telling his friends at school, but who would believe him? He was already the quiet kid, the bookish one. The last thing he needed was to be labeled as the boy who saw things that weren't there. His parents' disbelief only made it worse. The nights became long, filled with dread as he lay in bed, eyes fixed on the glass, waiting for the pale figure to show up. He'd try to fall asleep before it appeared, but no matter how hard he tried, it always seemed to appear just as he was drifting off. Michael would lie awake, heart pounding, hoping tonight would be different, but it never was. And deep down, he knew that whatever it wasn't going away. As the days turned into weeks, Michael grew more tired, more withdrawn. His once peaceful nights were now filled with anxiety and fear. The figure didn't do anything, didn't move or speak, but its presence alone was enough to keep him on edge. Even when the curtains were closed, he could feel it out there, watching, waiting. And that's when he realized the figure wasn't just some passing nightmare. It was real. It was there, and it wasn't leaving anytime soon. Years passed, but the memory of that eerie figure never left Michael. He and his family had moved multiple times after that first encounter, hopping from one house to another as his parents followed new job opportunities across Oregon. Despite the changes in scenery, the one thing that never changed was the figure. No matter where they went, the pale child would always return. At first, Michael thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, some leftover fear from his childhood. But the figure was real. He knew it. It didn't make sense to him. How could this figure, keep finding him? Every new house meant a new bedroom, a new window to stare out of, but the pattern remained the same. Each time, after a few weeks of relative peace, Michael would glance outside at night, and there it was, standing just far enough to be in the shadows, but close enough for him to make out its unsettlingly still posture. The figure never seemed to age, still resembling that child from years ago. It didn't speak, didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. Michael tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. He was older now, and surely this kind of thing didn't happen to adults. Ghosts and creepy figures were the stuff of horror stories, not real life. But every time he let his guard down, that familiar chill would creep up his spine. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He'd sit at his desk trying to focus on his freelance writing work, but his mind would always wander back to the window. Was it out there? Was it watching him right now? Even his parents started to notice his growing paranoia. They chalked it up to stress, maybe too many late nights working. But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just stress. He began to dread the nighttime, when he'd inevitably be drawn to the window once again. It was like a compulsion, something he couldn't fight no matter how much he wanted to. And sure enough, every time he looked out, there it was, unmoving, watching. As time went on, the sightings became more frequent. The figure no longer waited weeks or months to reappear. It was becoming a constant presence, as if it was growing bolder, more confident. Michael started to question whether it had ever really left at all, or if it had just been lurking in the background, waiting for him to notice. The thought sent shivers down his spine. He couldn't escape it. No matter where he went, no matter how far he moved, the figure always found him. Michael began keeping the curtains closed, trying to block out the figure's gaze. But that only made things worse. Even with the windows covered, he could feel it out there, its cold, unblinking eyes piercing through the fabric into his very soul. He started sleeping with the lights on, as if that would somehow protect him. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. The figure wasn't afraid of the light. It wasn't afraid of anything. It was just patient. He'd try to distract himself with work, drowning in articles and deadlines, anything to keep his mind off the figure. But the more he tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. He couldn't stop thinking about it. What did it want? Why was it following him? Michael became obsessed with finding answers, diving into research about paranormal entities, hauntings, anything that might explain what was happening to him. But nothing seemed to fit. There was no explanation for a figure that appeared no matter where you went, no reason for it to target someone like him. The worst part was, it never did anything. It didn't knock on the window, didn't try to get in. It just stood there, waiting. But for what? That question gnawed at Michael, keeping him up at night, making every day feel like an eternity. And the longer the figure watched, the more certain he became that it was waiting for something he couldn't quite understand. Yet. By the time Michael reached his 30s, the figure had become more than just an unwelcome visitor. It was a shadow that clung to him, always on the periphery of his life, never truly gone. He had hoped that as he grew older the sightings would fade, that maybe his mind would outgrow whatever strange attachment this figure seemed to have. But it didn't. If anything, the figure had grown bolder. What started as a distant presence was now something much more ominous. Michael could no longer shake the feeling that it wasn't content with just watching. It wanted more. At first, the change was subtle. He'd lie in bed, the room dark except for the faint glow of his laptop, and he'd hear something. It was barely audible, like the faintest scratch on the glass. His rational mind tried to explain it away. Branches, wind, maybe an animal. But each night, the scratching would return, persistent and deliberate, like it was trying to get his attention. Michael stopped looking out the window. He didn't want to see what was there. But even when he kept his eyes away, he knew the figure was still watching. One night, after weeks of ignoring the scratching, it grew louder. It was no longer the faint sound he could dismiss. Now it was sharper, more insistent, as if something was trying to get inside. Michael sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't want to look, but he felt like he had no choice. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window, dread filling his stomach like a lead weight. The curtains were drawn, but even through the fabric, he could see the faint silhouette of the figure, closer than ever before. That was when it hit him. The figure wasn't just watching anymore. It was trying to get in. Michael felt a cold sweat break out across his skin as the realization sank in. For years, he had thought the figure was just some strange apparition, something that appeared but never interacted. But now, he wasn't so sure. The scratching on the window, the figure's increasing presence, it all pointed to one terrifying truth. It wanted something from him, and it wasn't going to stop until it got it. Michael's sleep became more and more disturbed. He began to wake up in the middle of the night, his body jolted awake by a sense of looming danger. Even during the day, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The figure had always been a nighttime terror, but now, even in broad daylight, he felt its presence. It was as if the boundaries of night and day no longer applied. The figure was with him constantly, hovering just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. He became paranoid. Every noise, every shadow sent him into a spiral of fear. He started avoiding windows altogether, keeping them covered at all times, even during the day. He convinced himself that if he didn't look, maybe it would stop. But the truth was, he could feel the figure's gaze on him no matter where he went. It was as if the air itself was charged with its presence, pressing in on him from all sides, suffocating him slowly. The worst part was the gnawing uncertainty. What did the figure want? Why had it followed him for so many years? And more importantly, why now? Why had it chosen this moment to escalate its presence? Michael had no answers, only questions that spun endlessly in his mind, driving him to the brink of madness. He couldn't confide in anyone. Who would believe him? Even if he tried to explain, the words would sound insane. So he kept it all inside, the fear festering, growing with each passing day. As the scratching grew more frequent and more intense, Michael knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. Whatever the figure wanted, it was getting closer. And Michael was running out of time. The night the figure appeared closer than ever, Michael's dread reached a new level. A storm had been brewing all day, the kind that rattles windows and sends trees thrashing in the wind. By the time night fell, the rain was coming down in sheets, and thunder boomed so loudly it shook the walls of his small apartment. Michael had always found storms unsettling, but this one felt different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that he couldn't shake. He tried to focus on his work, but his thoughts kept drifting to the window, covered tightly by thick curtains. The scratching had stopped for a few nights, which should have been a relief, but instead, it filled him with an even deeper sense of unease. It felt like the calm before a storm, a brief respite before something worse. He sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop casting shadows across the room, and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. But then, through the howl of the wind and the crash of the rain, he heard something. It wasn't the scratching this time. It was a low, rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate. Michael's blood ran cold. The tapping was coming from the window, and it wasn't random. It was purposeful, like someone, or something, was trying to get his attention. His heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward the sound, dread curling around his spine. He knew what he would see, but the reality of it was far worse than he had imagined. The figure was standing just inches from the glass, its pale face lit up by the occasional flash of lightning. For the first time, Michael could see it clearly. The figure's face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness. Its eyes, or rather the dark, hollow spaces where eyes should have been, stared straight at him. They weren't just empty. They were bottomless, as if they could suck the very life out of anyone who stared into them for too long. Michael couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure wasn't just outside anymore. It was practically inside, separated only by a thin pane of glass. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and Michael realized with horror that the figure's bony hand was pressed against the window, tapping with one long, crooked finger. It was as if it was asking to be let in, demanding his attention, its gaze unyielding. Michael wanted to run, to hide, but he was frozen in place, his body refusing to obey. He had seen this figure so many times before, but never like this. Never this close. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and for a brief moment, Michael thought he saw the figure's mouth twitch, as if it was trying to smile. But the expression was wrong, twisted, unnatural, like something that didn't understand what a smile was supposed to look like. The tapping continued, and Michael's breath hitched in his throat. He knew, deep down, that this was a turning point. The figure wasn't content with just watching anymore. It was preparing for something, and whatever it was, Michael wasn't ready. The rain pounded against the window, but it couldn't drown out the tapping. It was the only sound that mattered now, each tap like a countdown, signaling the approach of something terrible. Michael's mind raced, trying to think of what to do, but there was no plan, no escape. The figure was here, and it wasn't going to leave. Not this time. He backed away from the window, but the figure's eyes, or lack thereof, never left him, tracking his every movement with eerie precision. For the first time, Michael felt truly trapped. The figure was closer than ever before, and it was only a matter of time before it made its next move. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it was the figure's presence that dominated. Michael knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The figure had come for him, and it was just getting started. That night, something shifted in the air, and Michael knew this was it, the moment he had feared for so long. The tapping had turned into a soft rattle, and the glass of the window seemed to vibrate under the pressure. His heart pounded, each beat louder than the storm outside. He didn't want to look, didn't want to face what was just beyond the window pane, but it was impossible to ignore. The figure wasn't content with just watching anymore. It wanted in, and it was making that terrifyingly clear. The rattling grew more intense, shaking the window as if the figure was testing its strength. Michael backed away, his pulse racing. Every instinct told him to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. This wasn't something he could outrun, not anymore. The figure had found him in every home, every place he thought he could escape to. It had followed him across towns and years, and now it was closer than ever before. The window rattled violently, and for the first time, Michael heard the glass creak under the pressure. His breath caught in his throat. The figure was no longer just staring, it was trying to get in. The pale face pressed closer against the glass, those hollow black eyes fixed on him, unblinking, relentless. Michael's mind raced, but he couldn't think of anything that would make it stop. The figure didn't belong to this world, didn't play by the rules of logic or reason. It was something beyond, something that had no intention of stopping until it got what it wanted. The rattling turned into banging. The glass shook violently in its frame, and Michael knew it wouldn't hold for much longer. Panic surged through him, and he backed away, his eyes never leaving the window. The figure's expression hadn't changed. It was still that eerie, almost smile that sent chills down his spine. It wasn't angry, wasn't frustrated. It was patient, calculating. It knew it was only a matter of time before the barrier between them broke. Michael's thoughts were a whirlwind of terror. What would happen if the figure got in? What did it want from him? He had spent years trying to understand it, but now, in the face of this terrifying reality, none of his questions mattered. All that mattered was survival, and for the first time, he wasn't sure he would make it through the night. The banging grew louder, each hit sending a jolt of fear through his body. The figure wasn't going to wait much longer. It was coming for him. The glass cracked. A thin line appeared at the center of the window, spiderwebbing out as the force behind the banging intensified. Michael's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. He stumbled back, his mind a blur of fear and desperation. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze, those empty eyes boring into him, as if it could see right through him, into his very soul. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the window shattered. The storm outside howled, rain pouring in through the broken window, but Michael barely noticed. All he could see was the figure, stepping through the jagged remains of the glass, its pale, gaunt form now inside. It didn't rush, didn't hurry. It moved slowly, deliberately, its eyes never leaving him. Michael's back hit the wall, and he realized with a cold, sinking dread that there was nowhere left to run. The figure was here, and it wasn't leaving. As the figure moved closer, Michael could feel the temperature drop, the air growing heavy with its presence. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing in, suffocating him with the weight of his fear. He wanted to scream, to call for help, but no sound came. The figure stood before him now, its face inches from his own, and then it reached out, its cold, bony hand inches from Michael's chest. He knew in that moment that the figure wouldn't stop. It had waited long enough. Michael was out of time.